Joseph Riley. My name is Deborah Krause-Smith, and I am David's first cousin, twice removed. Although I never lived in Juda, my mother and both my grandparents are graduates of Juda High School, and at one time I was related to most of Juda through my mother's side of the family. I remember visiting my great-grandmother, Rose Asmus Seaman, many times here. Her brother, Elmer Asmus, was my great-grand-uncle, and he and his wife, Della, were David's foster parents. It is fitting and appropriate this Memorial Day weekend that we remember David, but we also want to reflect on the sacrifice made by every American man or woman who lost his or her life in service to our country. After all these years, we are almost unbelievably fortunate that David's remains will finally be laid to rest here in Juda with his foster parents, even after over 8 decades. But we also don't want to forget those whose final resting places are in national cemeteries or in American cemeteries overseas, or even in places that can't be reached or aren't even known. And now it is a great honor and privilege to be able to introduce to you United States Senator from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin.
It is a great honor, and I feel very privileged to be able to join you for this ceremony to honor the life of Seaman Second Class David Riley, who after 8 decades will finally be laid to rest this afternoon with his foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elmer and Della Asmus. It's fitting that this ceremony is taking place during the Memorial Day weekend, a time when we pause to honor the sacrifice of our country's men and women who gave their lives in service to our country. Today we share that sorrow and think of this young man whose life was cut short on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. That infamous day marked not just the start of World War II, but also a decade of service and sacrifice from the greatest generation and their loved ones who all endured such loss. As all of you know, it's not just the person who wears the uniform who serves. Military families make enormous sacrifices for our nation. Today, we also remember David's foster parents, Elmer and Della, who must have felt such pride when David left to join the Navy, and such pain when their son lost his life while serving his country, along with 428 shipmates on the USS Oklahoma. But for Elmer and Della, I hope they found solace in the shared grief of this close-knit community that has welcomed all of us here today in Juda. It is that same community that has kept David's memory alive all these years later. Through the work of the Greene County Historical Society, where David's medals are preserved and displayed, and through the Zilmer Riley American Legion Post 84, named in part after David. I also want to thank the many individuals and organizations whose hard work and perseverance helped bring David home, including the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the Navy Casualty Office, the Wisconsin Patriot Guard Riders, and David's foster relatives. I also want to share my particular appreciation for Deborah Krause-Smith, who reached out for support in gaining approval to bring David back to Juda, his hometown. It is a privilege to be of assistance in this way. As we will hear in the words of the anthem, Blades of Grass and Pure White Stones, from the Juda Church Choir in just a moment, David Riley will be buried here with dignity, alongside his loved ones, finally laid to rest in a community that fought to honor his legacy and bring him home. May David's soul rest in peace, and may the memory of his service and sacrifice live forever.
August 17th, 2021, almost 2 years ago. Out of the blue, I get a Facebook message from someone I don't know named Tony Van Campen, wondering if I'm a cousin of David Joseph Riley. Well, yes and no. I told him that David was the foster son of my maternal great-grand-uncle, Elmer Asmus, and his wife Della, who lived in Juda. Tony then explained that he was part of a veterans group called the Wisconsin Patriot Guard Riders, and that group was trying to help locate David's family because David's remains had been identified. I'm a hobby genealogist, and he had seen that I managed a memorial page for David on the website called findagrave.com. So that's how he found me. Tony then had the state captain of the Wisconsin Patriot Guard Riders, John Curran, contact me, and thus began the journey to bring David's remains back here to Juda. At that point, I really knew nothing about David other than he was Uncle Elmer and Aunt Della's foster son, and that he died at Pearl Harbor. That was it. My uncle, Jim Schmerzy, who was a Vietnam vet, had done a little bit of military research on him years ago, but I hadn't really looked at or remembered any of that in any great detail. And I certainly was not aware that there was something created in 2015 called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA for short, whose mission was to recover and identify missing military personnel from past conflicts using forensic technology, thus enabling their remains to be returned home for burial. Without this initial contact from the Wisconsin Patriot Guard writers, I would have known nothing about the DPAA or its mission. I would have known nothing about the identification of David's remains on February 24th, 2021, and we would likely not be here today. Excited that David's remains may be able to come back to Juda, I began seriously researching him right away. I am forever grateful to Hazel Modsky, Emerson Jordan, and Brian and Peggy Modsky, who are Juda historians and also foster cousins of David's, as well as Sherry Andrig of the Greene County Historical Society, for helping supplement my own research with old newspaper clippings and documents that definitely proved that Elmer and Della Osmus were David's foster parents and Juda was indeed David's home. But because David was a foster child and not my biological cousin, getting his remains returned here turned out to be complicated. Although John Curran of the Patriot Guard writers and I both tried to make contacts with the Navy to start the process to bring David home, there wasn't much traction. In fact, they kind of ignored both of us. About a month later, in September 2021, John reached out to a legislative office to try to get help in moving this case along, but that office told him that 3 biological relatives had been identified and they all lived out of state. End of story. My heart sank. In spite of that, I made another attempt to plead my case for David with the Navy, armed with ample documentation that his home was in Juda with Elmer and Della, but got nowhere, as in no response. I stewed about all of this for about a month, but I just couldn't let it go. I felt David really belonged here, not with DNA matches from people that had surrendered him almost 100 years ago. Out of frustration, I contacted the office of Senator Tammy Baldwin. Christine Ralph, the veteran service representative for Senator Baldwin's office, reached out to me by phone and listened to my story. I mean, she really listened. She was very understanding and empathetic, having served in the Navy herself. So she said she would contact the Navy and see what she could do, if anything. Lo and behold, a couple weeks later, she got a response from the Navy saying they were gathering information and she could expect a final reply by December 21st, 2021. Not surprisingly, that didn't exactly happen, but the Navy Casualty Office did ask me to give written permission for the documentation I had provided them to be viewed by a biological relative of David's that had been identified, which I gladly did. We went into 2022 and months went by with no word from the Navy. It became disheartening, and what once looked somewhat hopeful was starting to look hopeless again. Christine continued to check in with me periodically to see if there had been any movement, and then she would again make her own contact with the Navy. Finally, on November 10th of 2022, I received a call from the Navy Casualty Office telling me that I had been designated as the person authorized to direct disposition, or PADD for short, which meant David would be coming home to Juda. 2 personnel from the Navy Casualty Office in Millington, Tennessee came to Monroe in December of 2022 to do a briefing with me. They explained how David had been identified by the DPAA using genealogical tools, forensic DNA, and dental records. If any of you watched Finding Your Roots on public television, The process is somewhat like that, combining research by professional genealogists with scientific and DNA analysis. During the briefing, I also learned that the biological maternal cousin that had been identified declined the opportunity to make final arrangements for David's remains, stating they didn't know who he was or that he never even existed. Now, let me tell you a little about David Joseph Riley. In his own handwriting on Navy enlistment records, David listed his birth date as February 18, 1916, and his birthplace as Green Bay. According to a 1920 census record, his parents were named as George F. and Ethel J. Riley. George Riley, a fisherman, was significantly older than his wife, Ethel. I recently found a record indicating that his parents were not married until 1918, so maybe George Riley wasn't really his biological father. Who knows? According to a small article in a Brown County newspaper, it appears his parents divorced in 1924, and in another article in early 1925, it was written that Mrs. Ethel Riley and children left for Black Creek, Wisconsin. But only 2 years later, in 1927, the Children's Home Society in Madison placed David, who was then 11 years old, in the home of Elmer and Della Osmus of rural Juda. He became their foster son and their only child, as they had no biological children of their own. It is not known why David ended up in foster care. We can only speculate that perhaps the first decade of his life wasn't the most pleasant or stable. Along with his foster parents, David attended what is now the Juda Zion United Methodist Church and was a student in the Juda schools only into his sophomore year, which really wasn't unusual for that time. Although Hazel Motzke's research revealed that he wasn't exactly a stellar student, just yesterday, Sherry from the Greene County Historical Society found a public school diploma that was issued to him in 1931. My maternal grandmother, who would have been David's first cousin, once described him as a wild child, which, given his circumstances, was understandable and probable. Maybe he felt like he didn't fit in, or was embarrassed that he was a foster child. It was no doubt not an easy transition for him, especially being an older child at the time he went to live with Uncle Elmer and Aunt Della. As a young adult, he worked as a cleaner at Carlin Bakery, which was located just south of Monroe Square. Just this past week, I spoke with the only person still living who actually knew David, 101-year-old Helen Blair, who resides in an assisted living home in Monroe. She was 5 years younger than David when they both worked at Carlin Bakery, and during our visit, she described him repeatedly as a good egg, a really good guy. She said they would visit with each other as co-workers, but he never talked about his past or his home, and she said she wasn't one to pry either. She knew the Osmuses were his parents, but she said she could never figure out why David didn't go home. He would instead sleep on the sacks of flour in the bakery. This was in the late 1930s, so I told her that he probably didn't have transportation because the Osmuses lived in Juda, and even though the train ran between Juda and Monroe, the times maybe didn't match his work schedule. It's likely he couldn't afford his own place either. She said he would then disappear during the day, but she never knew where he went. But my guess is he was likely at what is now Amy's Corner Cafe in Monroe, where he worked as a cook. Helen's friendship probably meant more to David than she ever realized at the time, because after he entered the Navy, he sent her a scarf from Hawaii, which is now on display at the American Legion in Monroe. In 1939, David enlisted in the Wisconsin National Guard Company K and was discharged in 1940 so he could join the Navy. His discharge papers from the National Guard noted that he was of excellent character and faithful and honest in his service. In May 1940, at age 24, David enlisted for 6 years in the Navy, completed his initial training at Naval Station Great Lakes. Following a brief leave home in July 1940, David left for Bremerton, Washington, and was assigned to the USS Oklahoma as a Seaman second class, apparently engaged, according to one source, in radio work. As we all know, life changed on what started out as a normal, quiet Sunday morning on December 7th, 1941. Of the approximately 1,200 crew members assigned to the USS Oklahoma, David was one of the 429 who lost their lives at Pearl Harbor as the ship suffered multiple torpedo attacks from Japanese aircraft. 429. That's more than the population of Juda. Within 12 minutes, the ship capsized, trapping inside those who were performing their assigned duties in such events. David was only 25 years old. Back in Juda and other places in America, we can only imagine the disbelief and horror that families were experiencing, wondering what had happened to their family member during this attack. Back then, there wasn't instant communication like we've become so used to now. It wasn't until 2 agonizing weeks after the attack, on December 21st, 1941, right before Christmas, that Elmer and Della, David's foster parents, received a telegram informing them of the attack and that David was missing. My mom, who is now 93 years old, doesn't remember David himself because he was 14 years older than she was, but she does remember how devastated her Uncle Elmer and Aunt Della were by this horrific news and his surmised loss. It wasn't until almost 2 months later, on February 17, 1942, that the Osmuses received another telegram informing them that David had lost his life in service to his country. Ironically, the telegram came just 1 day before what would have been David's 26th birthday. By 1944, David's remains, along with the other casualties from the USS Oklahoma, were removed from the ship and interred in Hawaii. In 1947, these remains were disinterred for possible identification, but only 35 men were identified, and David was not one of them. His remains, along with the other unidentified sailors, were reinterred in commingled caskets in the cemetery known as the Punch Bowl in Honolulu. In 1949, David's remains were officially declared non-recoverable and remained so until 2015. But David was never forgotten here. In the years following the Pearl Harbor attack, David was awarded a Purple Heart, the American Campaign Medal, and the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal. The Juda class of 1946 placed a plaque in the school memorializing 3 young men from Juda who lost their lives during World War II: Glenn Rice, Raymond Monsky, and David. That plaque is still in this school today, and you can view it just inside the east entrance to the school. Monroe's American Legion Post was initially the Zillmer American Legion Post, named for Glenn Zillmer, who was Greene County's first casualty of World War I. But in 1947, the post was renamed the Zillmer Riley American Legion Post, honoring David as the first casualty of Greene County in World War II. Recently, Senator Baldwin's office crafted a congressional record statement to commemorate David and today's event, which has been entered into a permanent congressional record. And just yesterday, Governor Evers issued a proclamation honoring and remembering David for his service, with a request for flags throughout the state to be flown at half-staff today. David's foster mother, Della, died in 1960, and his foster father, Elmer, in 1976. Although they no doubt came to accept the fact that David would remain somewhere in Hawaii, they made a point of memorializing him on their gravestone with a marker for him as well. He would always still be their son. Through no fault of his own, David experienced perhaps not the best of circumstances in his short life. But in the Navy, I think he was beginning to find himself, to find purpose and meaning for himself. In a final letter home before Pearl Harbor happened, David seemed to realize the seriousness of life, acknowledging that he had missed opportunities in his life prior to the Navy, and that he intended to make up for that when he returned. Of course, he never had that opportunity. At events such as this one today, remembering and honoring David's service to his country is, of course, paramount. But just as important was the life of that little boy who ended up in foster care. That teenager who didn't do well in school and perhaps felt like he didn't fit in. That young man who was just beginning to find his way through gainful employment and then enlisting in the Navy. And the little rural community and the kind-hearted couple that took him in and gave him roots, whether he realized it at the time or not. I hope that in whatever hereafter David has been residing, he now knows for certain how much he has been cared about here, and that he has never been forgotten. Thank you.
Now, face. from whom can we seek help? Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. God, who raised Christ from the dead, will give life to your mortal bodies also through the Spirit that dwells in you. Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. Then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also dwells secure. Lord, show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Let us pray. O God, you have ordered this wonderful world and know all things in earth and in heaven. Give us such faith that by day and by night, at all times and in all places, we may, without fear, commit ourselves and those dear to us to your never-failing love, in this life and in the life to come. Amen.
Oklahoma. It was actually commissioned in 1911, and the keel was laid in 1912. The ship was completed in 1960. And it was the first of two battleships. Its sister ship was the Nevada. They were the first two ships that actually were oil instead of water, which gave the ship a longer distance that it could travel. And so it was part of World War I at the end of it in 1918, and it did escort duty in the Atlantic. And fast forward to the late 20s, and in 1927-29, it went to Philadelphia, and they put steel belts around the sides of the ship. And the ship was upgraded, bigger guns, more 5-inch guns, and modernized, more armor. That bulge that went around the side becomes important. Okay? That was protected from torpedoes. December the 6th, the Oklahoma had been out sailing, and it came into port. And the only place that was available was right beside USS Maryland on the outside of Battleship Road. So it came in on the 6th, and it wasn't supposed to come in. It was supposed to be on patrol. But there was going to be an admiral's inspection on the next day, on Monday, and so all the ships were in the harbor for this inspection. December 7th, somewhere around 7:55 a.m., the first planes from the Japanese Imperial Air Force come in, and they drop torpedoes. And Oklahoma was either the first one hit or near the first one hit. Two torpedoes hit midship, a few feet apart, maybe 100 feet apart. And that blew away that bulge that I just told you about. But they did not penetrate the ship. The third one hit between the two, and it blew a hole in the ship into engineering. It blew into two of the boiler rooms, which started flooding very quickly. Followed in the next few minutes, 6 more torpedoes hit the ship on that side. So flooding occurred really quick. Within 12 minutes, at 8:08, the ship rolled over 135 degrees, the mast hitting the bottom of the harbor, which is what stopped it from rolling. And sailors were thrown into the water. Some had escaped and went over to the Maryland, and they were actually fighting from the Maryland. They were participating in the battle. The ship was also being strafed by Japanese fighters coming in and shooting at the sailors on top of the ship. When the ship rolled over, 429 sailors and Marines died. Some were trapped inside. Most of them were trapped in the ship. The ship couldn't be righted back up until late in 1943. That's when the bodies were recovered. Of those recovered, recovered, only 35 could be identified, which leaves 394 that were, including Seaman Riley, who was unidentified, that were buried in Washington. In 2015, those graves were exhumed, and thanks to modern science and DNA, they were able to identify 361 of those sailors' graves, including I stand here today in awe and honor of him because I think about what he did. He volunteered for the Navy at a time when we knew we were going to war. We had two countries, Japan and Germany, with expansionistic tendencies, and we knew we were going to war. He was part of the Great Generation, and he stepped forward and took on what his nation needed for him to do. Why do I tell you that? In today's world, we have two nations with formidable navies that have expansionistic tendencies. There's a good chance we're going to be that greatest generation again. He reminds me that freedom isn't always free, and that it's the task of every generation to take up the arms when needed and to fight for our country when it's needed. Again, I want to thank you today for allowing me to be here and sharing with you. I'd love to have a chance to meet you and talk to you after. We're going to bow before each of our military honors. We're going to have the gun salute. I'm going to present the flag to the family. After the flag is presented, taps will be played. That will be your cue that the service is ended.